All right. If actually not servers, if I can just have the singers up here, we're gonna start singing. And if everybody can get their way to their seats. Alrighty. And we're gonna start with "Sing Amen Amen." I think it's gonna be a minute to get words up there, but we all know those words. They're pretty simple. Sing Amen Amen. Sing. Amen, amen, rejoice, amen, amen, glory be to God, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen, rejoice, amen, amen, glory be to God, amen, amen, when the Lord shall come again, woo, let the people sing, amen, amen, when the Lord shall come again, woo, let the people sing, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen. Let the people sing, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen. Let the people sing, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen, rejoice, amen, amen. Glory be to God, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen, rejoice, amen, amen. Glory be to God, amen, amen. When the Lord shall come again, woo, let the people sing, amen, amen. When the Lord shall come again, woo, let the people sing, amen, amen. Sing, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen. Let the people sing, amen, amen. Sing, amen, amen, sing, amen, amen. Let the people sing, amen, amen. All right. We're singing two songs, My Only Hope Is You and I Can Sing of Your Love, and then we'll have one request. So think about what you want to sing. My only hope is you, Jesus. My only hope is you, Lord. From mountains and the sea. Your river runs with love for me, and I will open up my heart and let the healer set me free. I'm happy to be in the truth, and I will daily lift my hands, for I will always sing of when your love came down. I could sing of your love forever. 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 Over the mountains and the sea, your river runs with love for me, and I will open up my heart and let the healer set me free. I'm happy to be in the truth, and I will daily lift my hands, for I will always sing of when your love came down. I could sing of your love forever. 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 Oh, I feel like dancing. It's foolishness, I know. But when the world has seen the light, they will dance with joy like we're dancing now. I could sing of your love forever. I could sing of your love forever. I could sing of your love forever. I could sing of your love forever.
All right, what else do we want to sing tonight? Mighty to Save. That was quick. Quick.
Everyone needs compassion, love that's never failing. Let mercy fall on me. Everyone needs forgiveness, the kindness of a Savior, the hope of nations. Savior, he can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save forever. Author of salvation, he rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Take me as you find me, all my fears and failures. Fill my life again. I give my life to follow everything I believe in. Now I surrender. Savior, he can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save forever. Author of salvation, He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Savior, he can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Savior, he can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save. He is mighty to save. Forever, author of salvation. He rose and conquered the grave. Jesus conquered the grave. Shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King. Jesus, shine your light and let the whole world see. We're singing for the glory of the risen King.
You'll be seated.
Good evening. Hi, y'all. Hi, Mitch. Okay. Let's see. So quite a few announcements. If you want to donate for a gift card to Lisa Minson's brother to help him set up his classroom, he's going to be a special education teacher here. He and his wife and their child's not born yet. So that's weird. They're moving here this weekend. So if you want to donate for that gift card for his classroom, see Peggy Johnson tonight for either cash or Venmo, all that good stuff. The teens are going on a Swanee River trip. I don't know if I said that right. Good, thank you. So Leslie needs to meet with all the parents of the teens going on that trip after midweek tonight in the teen room. So if you're a teen going on that trip, your parents need to meet with Leslie. The marriage conference is September 14th through 15th in Daytona. Yes, same. He's hungry. The Young Professionals Dinner is this Friday at 7 p.m. RSVP on Facebook. And then is the How to Study the Bible class tonight? Yes, so that is tonight, 8:45 to 9:30 after midweek. So if you want to stay for that, you can. I think that is everything. Are there any birthdays? No, no one. Oh, there we go. We got one. Okay. Okay. So if you will please tell us your name, and if you want to share your age, you can. Carol. Ooh. There you go. Yay. Miss Carol. Hey, ma'am. Sherry. 67. Wow. Okay. So I guess we'll go in this order. Beautiful. Sherry and Carol. I'm not missing one, right? Okay. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Sherry and Carol. Happy birthday to anniversaries. Yay! Awesome. Can I get your names and how many years you have been married? Tab and Heather, 20 years. Amazing. Okay. Oh no, I'm looking at the teens. Sorry. Happy anniversary to you. Happy anniversary to you. Happy anniversary, Tab and Heather. Happy anniversary to you. Woo! Hey.
All right. Hey, am I on back? Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. All right, can you hear me now? So here's what we have tonight. We're going to have a little love feast. All right? Yeah, I'm glad you guys are so excited. This is like, man, not an excitable crew tonight. It's like Tab and Heather married 20 years. You have like one person. Can we give them a round of applause? 20 years. There we go. Thanks. Jeez. It is okay to get excited about a thing or two here, man. All right, so I know one thing you guys will get excited about. There's food. Here's the only instruction I have. Yes. All right. There we go. I need you to get your food as fast as possible. This is not our normal CrossWay. I'm going to talk my whole way down the line and pick at things and maybe comment on who made this and who did that. No. Get your food and get back in your seat, okay? That's the only unloving thing we're going to say tonight. Look. All right, so can we all agree to do that? Okay, so there's the food. You know how to operate the utensils, everything else. Go. Oh, thanks. That was all part of my plan. Look, they were following instructions. They were like, man, y'all better watch out. They're not taking prisoners. So we'll give a choice. It's going to be a relatively short class tonight, and it's going to be child-friendly, and there'll be food involved. So whatever kids want to stay out here, you can stay out here. I think, are teens staying out here? Teens are staying out here. Maybe I leave it up to everyone's best judgment. So if you want your kids to go back there, great. If not, I'm throwing a big old grenade in the children's church stuff right now. So without further ado, let's go get our food, and we'll figure out the kids' stuff. We'll pray. Hey, here's what we're going to do. So we're going to go on both sides of the bar so we can make this a little faster. So start going both sides of the bar. Express lane. Both sides of the bar. There we go. Yeah, I loved it, dude. That was great. Hey, John, can you kill the podium mic? All right, we're going to go ahead and get started as the last few people go through line there. And welcome. This is Love Feast style right here. This is not going to be a regular occurrence, you know. But I figured it'd be good. We're talking about communion, so this would be a great idea for us to celebrate kind of togetherness and communion in Christ with an actual meal. Chris kind of gave a spoiler away Sunday, but how was communion celebrated in the first century? What was it called? I can see Sunday was arousing anybody. Bueller? Does somebody say a love feast? A love feast. There we go. So, funny thing is, we have ideas of how it was celebrated. There were love feasts that happened, and that was probably, Acts 2:42, enjoying the favor of those, breaking bread together. We also do know from a lot of the writings from right around 100 AD on that as at least part of these feasts, there was a celebration with bread and wine. So to celebrate, we brought some wine, and but there was a celebration of bread and wine. There was, even within the love feast, us getting together and doing things, there was a separate celebration of the Eucharist, of Christ's body. And it's interesting to think about what Chris said Sunday is we are celebrating a tradition that's a couple thousand years in the making every Sunday. And it's, I've always found it kind of ironic. If you want a very divisive topic in Christianity today, it is communion. There are people that believe, no, you do it once a year. And you don't do it any more than that. And then there are people like, no, you do it once a quarter. Because we know back then they celebrated things on a quarterly basis, right? You had your first quarter fiscals come out. And then your mid-year budget projections. And the third quarter was always communion, right? No, so you have people, but you want to start arguing. It's amazing the petty things that Christians will argue about. And really, if you go back to Matthew 26:26, it's very simple. Jesus basically gives us an example of what we should do. While they're eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this and eat. This is my body." Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And then later on, Paul restates this in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 20-ish, 24, where he talks about when you get together to celebrate the Lord's Supper, don't forget Jesus' words, to remember him. And I wanted to kind of break down just a couple of things that really were of interest to me. So we talk a lot about covenant. Who knows what a covenant is? We don't talk about covenants a lot. Actually, they recently did make the news in Tallahassee, some really bad covenants that happened in a homeowners association. Probably the first time the word covenant had been used in the newspaper in 50, 60 years. What does a covenant mean? Contract, agreement, all the other stuff. And we know, well, it's in my Bible. There's the old covenant and the new covenant. And we talk about this, Jesus talking about a new covenant. And it's used all through the Bible. Who in here has actually used the word covenant this week at work? Bonus points? Anybody? Did you really? There you go. One. Real estate. Yeah. Christian did too? Okay. All right. Well, that works too. So simply put, this can be a really tricky biblical topic, is the concept of a covenant. And I just wanted to run through a couple of things and real quick, and then we're going to get into kind of more of the several key points about communion. But I think it's really important. A covenant in the Bible is, yes, it is first and foremost a promise by God, right? It's a promise of God. But there's a second part to that that's really important. Along with that promise, there's a separate and corresponding part. What is that? We know there's a promise. That's great. I love when people promise things. There's an expectation in any covenant. And if you look at this, anybody in here is like a business law expert? In any business contract, there's performance on both sides of the contract, right? A covenant is no different. There's performance expected on both sides. And there's really, it really is. God offers partnership or some kind of promise, and then there's an expectation on our behalf as well too. Make sense? So in the Old Testament, bonus points for this, there's 4 main covenants. And you guys, no, there's the old covenant, right? No, there's really 4. Anybody know those 4 covenants of the Old Testament? Whose name? Give me one. Raise a hand and speak loudly. The Abraham covenant. The Mosaic covenant, we'll go with that. The Israelites covenant, yep. The Noah covenant. And the covenant with David. Right. 4 main covenants. Each one of them, I kind of wrote them down because it's really hard to remember. The Noah, what was God's promise? I'll never destroy the world like this again. And what was our expectation? Nothing. There was no expectation in that covenant. So that's kind of the odd one. There's the outlier. If you're ever at a cocktail party and you really want to get somebody with your trivia, you can ask them that question, right? Next one, Abraham. What did God promise? I will bless your family and you will flourish. And what was the expectation? That you will trust and obey me and you will follow me and you will teach your children about me. Okay, then the covenant with Israel. This is the Mosaic one. What was the promise of God? I'll make you a great nation. I will bless you among the people of the earth. What was the expectation? You'll follow my 10 commandments. And actually there's more than that. You'll follow my commandments. And then the covenant with David. That the Savior would come through the family of David. And what was the expectation for David? That you'll follow me, that you'll obey me and worship me, right? What happened with all 4 of these covenants? They were all broken. We failed miserably at every single one of those. But this is kind of the neat thing. I wanted to bring it up because I think, remember, we go back to this in studying 1 Corinthians. In order to understand even a section of the Bible, we've got to understand what the Bible meant to the people that were reading it, and what it means to us, and how it all fits together in this great picture. So, if you go all the way back to Genesis 1, God's original plan for mankind was what? Before the fall, that we would be co-creators and partners with him in his creation. Right? And then we ruined that because we wanted to do things our own way. And then you have the establishment of these different covenants, right? They're all broken because we wanted to do it our own way. So then the new covenant comes out. And what is the new covenant that Jesus gives us? The promise of salvation. And what's the expectation on our part? That we obey Jesus' teachings and worship him. Right? You want to know the real kicker? if you really want to kind of blow your mind on this, go back and look at the Bible. Jesus actually fulfills our obligation in the other covenants as well. He's a descendant of Noah. He's a descendant of Abraham. He comes from the tribe from David's family. And he's completely obedient to God's law. I mean, it's really fascinating to see all these circles within circles that come together. And you look at, so Jesus is coming down and saying, you know what? I give you a new covenant that I fulfill. And this is all I ask. And this is what we're celebrating. And Jesus is calling us to this. He says, you know what? He's not saying I just give you this gift, but he's also laying out the expectation. I'm giving you salvation. The expectation on our part is laying down our lives for him. And it's something we should celebrate every time we take the emblems, the bread and the wine, the bread and the juice. Communion is an interesting thing for us. So here's the kind of the gist of what I want to talk about tonight. We run the risk in America of comfortable Christianity, of cultural Christianity. Does anyone disagree with that? See, the way I worded that, like if you did disagree, you probably wouldn't want to raise your hand. But when you think about it, we run the risk of easily getting wrapped up in comfortable cultural Christianity, and the communion part of our service is no exception to this. It's very easy. There are people who have dedicated their lives to coming to church every Sunday, every Wednesday, being there, serving the food behind the counter, volunteering every chance they get, doing every spiritual thing they can think of, calling themselves Christian, that have no more relationship with God than the person sitting next to them who's there for the first time. Isn't that kind of scary? And I think it's a trap we can fall into. And I want all this to point back to the fact, why would Jesus establish a meal in remembrance of him? So I want us to keep that question there, but I want us to keep thinking about this. It's really easy to get wrapped up in the trappings of coming to church and not wrapped up in being a disciple of Christ. I'll say it one more time. It's easy to get wrapped up in the trappings of coming to church and not being a disciple of Christ. So I want us to think about that. I think that is the message of having communion all the time. What was the neat thing? Did you guys, anybody sit back and observe what happened when the food was served? Conversations start. Everybody, from right now, everyone in the room is like this. Right? The food's eaten, their stomach's full, and they're like, okay, what's coming up next? Once there's food, man, everybody's smiling. There wasn't a sad face in the room. Right? Everybody's happy. Everybody's talking. Everybody instantly went to each other, and they're talking in line, and they're feeding, they're looking at this, and they're asking the questions and taking forever in line. Oh, who made this? And who made this? No. But no, you think about it, we have, I think, a tie-in. God knows what we need to function. And what do we do multiple times a day? Some of us more than others? Eat. What's the number one way to bond with coworkers and other people and stuff like that, right? Break bread together. What's one thing you're going to do regardless? You may miss everything else on your schedule. What's one thing you're going to get accomplished for the day? Eat. Right? This is something, and it really is. Jesus wants us to equate relationship with him with something as fundamental and unmistakably human as eating. And so it makes no sense. Kind of a neat thing. You look at what the early church was known for. Acts 2:42, they met everyone's needs, and what did they do every single day? They met together and broke bread. I'm like, I can get behind that church. You think about it. What if every day we lived in a community where we all got together, broke bread, glad and sincere hearts, and met everyone else's needs? Sign me up. I'm also fairly certain that's how many, many cults get started. No, I'm kidding. No, but if there's food, I'm okay with that. No. Yeah. What kind of food are we talking? Really? But no, you think about this. We have this celebration, and Jesus gives us very, very few commands in the New Testament. You guys ever notice that? 600-something commands in the Old Testament. How many commands in the New Testament? Very few. A couple dozen. And one of them is what? Do this in remembrance of me. Celebrate this meal together. So I want us to think about that. The other part I want us to dig into is 1 Corinthians 11. Let's look at this. In verse 33, he spends the whole chapter talking about the Lord's Supper, and he wraps it up with this. So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for each other. If anyone is hungry, he should eat at home, so that when you meet together, it may not result in judgment. When I come, I will give further directions. I think it's very clear, looking at this, that the celebration of the Eucharist, the celebration of communion, is not an ordinary part of the meal. And I think, some of this hopefully gets real practical for us on Sunday, because this is something we don't give a lot of instruction on. How should we celebrate when we come together? It's not an ordinary meal. We ate tonight for fun. When we eat together Sunday and celebrate the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, it's not an ordinary meal, nor should we treat it like that. I've been there. You ever been there and you miss breakfast and the little plate of communion comes by and you're like, well, I want the biggest cracker on the plate? Right? I'm not the only one that's done this. All right? You think about it. We treat it like it's just an ordinary food. What Jesus calls us to do is this is a separate meal. This is a time of reflection. This is an understanding that he is the new covenant. In his blood it's established, and it's a new relationship. And when we take the juice and the bread, we're actually entering into that contract again. It's a reaffirmation of the contract we've established with Christ. Wow, that's different than just listening to somebody talk and then having a cracker and some juice. If we thought of it that way, I think the period would be of introspection would be even more critical. In 11:28, we go back there. Anyone who ever eats and drinks of the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner would be guilty of sinning of the body and blood of Christ. We know from Chris's sermon Sunday, he's not talking about being sinless. But when we eat of it in an unworthy and an unholy and an unappreciative manner, when we eat with lack of respect for the sacrifice that happened and the gravity of the contract that we're entering into, there's a problem there. This is something. There's brothers that do communion in here, and I'll say this because I remember thinking the first time I got asked to do communion, I think we were still at Cornerstone, and it was like, wow, I get to do communion. It's like really cool. And I got up there and I'm like, I want to make sure I leave people thinking that I'm a great speaker and I have a really witty speech and I do this and I get focused on, man, how am I gonna make this really entertaining, right? And for those of you guys out there that do communion, maybe it's just me, but maybe you guys have thought the same thing too. But it's not an ordinary meal. And it's a time for us to be introspective. And really the purpose of the person teaching the communion message is to do nothing except get people to the cross of Christ. Communion would be successful if the person got up and read Matthew 26. Because it's not about the person speaking, it's about us getting in our own mind, getting in our own heart, getting in our own actions, and asking the Spirit, asking God to work through us and show us who we are in the light of the cross. And that's a powerful thing. It goes beyond a cracker and some juice at that point. Does that make sense? And that really goes into kind of the third little practical point there is if we're not focused on Jesus during that time of our Sunday service, we're doing it wrong. There is a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. 1 Corinthians 11 is great. Go back and listen to the sermon from Sunday. Let's look at some of the practicals on that. If we're not appreciating the fact that it's not an ordinary meal, if we're not taking time to do self-reflection like we're commanded to, and if we're not focused on Jesus, we're not doing it right. And that goes on both sides. That goes from people in the pulpit to the people in there, anybody who's taking it, to the ushers who are serving it. If we're not, as a body, focused on Jesus, we're doing it wrong. So I want to tie that back to the point I made earlier about being casual Christianity. Why is this such a big deal? Because here's the thing. Our faith is an empty faith without Jesus. Unless we're focused on Jesus in every area of our life, and I think that's why I don't think there's a restriction on how often we can take communion. I think if we met together every day as a church, we should take communion together every day. I think there should be a time where we set aside and think about our commitment to Christ and the sacrifice he's done, and we reaffirm the covenant. I don't think there's a law on that. You know, when it talks about fruits of the Spirit, there's no restriction on things that are good and from God. I wouldn't think there'd be a restriction on this. But the reason I bring up, to go back to that, of casual Christianity and the communion service is this. Just like communion without Jesus is nothing more than juice and crackers, our faith without Jesus is empty and meaningless. Without a focus on Jesus and following him in everything we do, we're living an empty and faithless religion. And I think what communion should do, and I'd like for all of us to do moving forward, is not just enjoy the food and the fellowship and everything else, because that's what makes CrossWay great. That's what I really like about this. You know, you look at Sunday, there's a ton of people here. You know, it's so big that maybe you don't know everybody, but you have good friends. And it's great to show up for church and have a fellowship and everything else, and that's awesome. But that's also the social aspect. And if we come to church and we serve and we do everything else, like we're going to get into in the rest of 1 Corinthians, and actually 2 Corinthians hits this as well, if we do this without a deep and profound commitment to Christ at the core of our life, we're doing it wrong. Our whole faith is wrong. Does that make sense? And I think it's good. Communion and things like this should call us back to why we're really here. Because if I'm here for Mitch, because I like hanging out with Mitch, you know, or if I'm here because I like working out with the guys in the morning and, you know, Christian, Tab, and everyone here that works out in the morning, this is what we do and this is where my buddies are, I'm doing it wrong. And not just in an unfulfilling way, but in a way that's not going to draw me closer to God. And it goes back to this. I think the questions for us to ask ourselves tonight is this. Am I as committed? Did I renew this Sunday when I did communion? Did I renew my commitment to the covenant? Did I renew my commitment to Christ? Am I as committed to God's word as I was in the beginning? Does God's word, we had a discussion with another couple this last week where it's so funny because, like, you know, you talk about worldly problems. Like, you get together and you talk about, hey, you know, what do you guys think about this? How often do we start by going back to the word? Well, hey, whether you're talking about parenting, marriage, business, friends, social stuff like that, before we open our mouths with worldly advice, do we go back to what the Bible says? Or is it easy to kind of bypass that? Do we have that commitment to Christ in every aspect of our life, or are we getting in to be more casual Christians? And I think, how are these two related? The further we get away from really having that deep, profound love for the covenant, that deep, profound love for communion and celebrating that Eucharist every Sunday when we get together, I think in a lot of ways it's a barometer for where we are in the rest of our spiritual life. The further and further we can get away from the teachings of Christ, the devotion to Jesus, the walking every day in that way. Any thoughts on this? I told you it would be quick. I don't have a ton left. I did want to bring those practical things up, and I want to recap them before we leave. But any thoughts? Right. Yeah. So what Kevin's saying is when it becomes just a rule-following religion, it's going to sap the joy. When you understand the why behind what we do and the why behind what our purpose and our destiny is, it makes it actually a relationship and a covenant. Good point. You mentioned Acts 2:2. Yep. Where they broke bread daily. Yeah. Now, why do we only break bread on Sundays and not Wednesdays as well? And should we in our personal life break bread all the time? Or I don't. What's our reasoning why? So the question is, why do we only do it on Sundays? Part of it is tradition. We know that the first century church at minimum did it when they came together on the first day of the week. We know that for sure. Is there a prohibition against, say, you and the teens or you and the college or you and whoever you hang out with and get together to say, you know what, let's have communion? Is there any prohibition against it? Not that I know of. There actually are some first century writings, I think it was actually second century, where there was one writer, I can't remember his name, maybe Origen, says that communion should only be given by a bishop. I don't see that in the Bible. I don't see that as anything in the Bible. But, yeah, I don't think there is a problem. If you want to do it as a family, if you want to do this as something you do daily, every time the college group gets together, if you guys want to have communion, make sure you do it right. Make sure it's biblical. But is it a bad thing to reaffirm our commitment? Absolutely not. Could we do it more? Absolutely. I think the only so the question is this: is there any time where it's not best? I think there's two really clear prohibitions in the New Testament. One is if you have something against a brother or sister, or you know that a brother or sister has something against you, you're commanded to reconcile that before you. If the person has something against you, it's before the gifts go to the altar. So I think there's a correlation there. But if you have something against a brother, communion is prohibited until you're reconciled. The other one, too, is I believe more of a conscience issue, which he talks about here. If you're doing it in an unworthy manner, you're better off not doing it. What is an unworthy manner? Mitch? No, I'm kidding. That's it. Help? Now, my understanding is this. Unworthy manner would be when you are not in a right relationship with God, when you are not reconciled with yourself, when there's a disturbance in the heart, or anything else. All right? Right. Yeah. 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 Hmm. Absolutely. But that's also where the new covenant comes with grace. I mean, that's where this kind of gets mind-blowing over and over and over again, where it's like, hey, you know what? I've got a covenant you can't fail at. The only way you can fail at this covenant is if you willfully turn your back on it. That's pretty amazing. Not only am I going to make up for everything else, but I'm also going to give you this new one. I mean, it just kind of makes you deepen your appreciation for what God does. Hope? Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Mhm. Right. Right. Yeah. That's great. Yes. Between eating, yes. So Acts 2:42, my understanding is the breaking of the bread there. It probably was them eating meals together. The other side of it too, though, is it does seem like from at least on the first day of the week there was communion service, like the Eucharistic service. And I don't think the Acts 2:42 necessarily rules out that they probably did it more often than that. It would make sense, but yeah. Yeah, it's when we do it, we remember him. Yeah, that's the command. No, yeah. That's kind of the aspect I'm taking. But what Donnie's saying is basically there's a command that when we do it, we remember him. And that's about it. And my thing is if there's no law against things that are good and things that are devoted to God, and that's the fact that we have a framework for doing it, I don't think there's anything that prohibits us from doing it more frequently. Yes, absolutely. I think it was. Yep. Mm. Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. You can't have it both ways. Right. Right. Mm. It's intimate.
The best representation is at a funeral.
Mhm.
Because the emotions are there that are joy, and you tell stories.
Mhm.
There's the grief and the loss, and when I remember Jesus, I think of the things that he did. I'm just, wow, that just blows me away. I'm also filled with pain into what he did for me.
Yeah.
And so at those times when I'm at funerals,
Mhm.
and we're sitting at the table, and someone tells a funny story, I'm like, that's what communion should be.
Right.
We're remembering that person's life and death
Mhm.
in a way that honors them and brings us together.
Closer together. Absolutely. When did it change? The initial question. So, if you guys want a good resource, Burko has a book called The Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs, where he's done nothing except compile writings from the early church fathers. And these writings go back early as, I think, 95, 100 AD, all the way through 300 and 400 AD. So all the big writers. And that's where the difficult thing is we don't have like video camera footage of how they celebrated things, and there is some discrepancy between the breaking of bread and the breaking of bread. But when did it switch to emblems as opposed to an actual meal? Some of the writings that I saw in there were as early as, I think one of them was 105 AD to 140 AD, and they were talking about specifically bread and wine at that point, because back then the big controversy was over wine. Some people were trying to use water, and that caused a big hullabaloo. But I would actually say it started fairly early, but again, I don't have a firm date on this date everything transitioned. I do like the idea of meals, and I say this, we focus on hospitality and having people into your house. There's no law against celebrating communion together. If you have another set of disciples in your house, do it. It is a great time. Food brings us together in a way that almost nothing else brings us together. If you want to do a great experiment, go to your workplace and bring a dozen donuts. I'm serious. I do this all the time. It's great. You go to Donut Kingdom on the way into work. You bring a dozen donuts. You could put them in the far end of the office where nobody ever goes, and that's going to be the congregating place. So I think the meal's great. I think there's something to it. As for us, every Sunday, man, if we want to have breakfast together, man, somebody get that organized. Well, I'm right on board with that. So I want to go back to this so we don't lose sight of it and we get out of here at a reasonable time is this. I want us to remember this Sunday when we come together to celebrate the Lord's Supper. I just want to have a couple key things. One is we've got to make sure we're avoiding a focus on anything that's not Jesus, right? That it's not an ordinary meal. Self-examination is critical before we take the emblems. And above all else, in everything we do, it's got to be focused on Jesus. And hopefully these messages trickle out from communion into our day-to-day lives. And we're not cultural Christians, that we really are a radical group of people committed to Christ and his followings in every way, and his word in every way. And through that, we change our families, we change our workplaces, and we change the world around us. So going back to that, this Sunday, let's take a different focus to it. I hope we enjoyed the meal together tonight. It was a mishmash. I'm glad Chris was not here because I'm fairly certain none of that is healthy. But anyway, there's still food back there. Thanks for your attention. If you have any questions or comments, you want to come up and talk about it, I really like this subject. Shirley? It's Bercot, B-E-R-C-O-T, Bercot, however you pronounce it, and it's called the Dictionary of Early Christian Beliefs. Let me give you a quick caveat on this. It's very easy to be like, wow, this was early on in the church. This must be right. Not so, right? Sorry. Heresies started early on in the church. So it's neat to look at it and read and see the dialogue that was happening between people. But remember, we live by the Bible. And while the writings of the early church fathers are informative and a lot of times very scripturally based and very good for our faith, there definitely are some things in there, like the teaching that a communion can only be administered by a bishop. Right? So, great resource. I highly recommend it. It's topically organized. If you want to know what the first century church, they wrote about everything from abortion to infanticide to politics to clothing and modesty. You name it, it's in there. And it is fascinating to read. And it's topical. So if you have a question, you can look up just that one topic. But I always like to give people a caveat. It's not the Bible. And while it's informative, you still need to read it with a discerning mind. Make sense? Okay. Let's finish off the food so people have less to take home. All right.